morning, everyone. I'm Reagan Sokolowski, a marketing specialist too with ESC Spectrum. Thank you for joining us for the What's New in Prism 1.8 webinar led by our QA Manager Doug Novy. He'll be taking you through the new updates and features of our latest Prism release. If you have any questions, please type them into the question pane and we will get those answered at the end of the presentation. All right, take it away, Doug.
Good morning. Thanks for the intro. Today we're going to talk about what's new in Prism 1.8 that just got released. But before we dive into all the features and the work we did, it's important to talk about platform support, right? So starting with Prism 1.8, the release we're talking about today, we are making an effort to make our platform support consistent across all of our software products. So Stack Vision, Prism, QA Insight, all the things. We're making it so that the .NET framework, the Windows Server, the Windows Client, SQL Server, we support everything the same across the products. And so kind of what that looks like is SQL Server 2016 and Windows Server 2016 support is going to come to an end soon, but all of these other things like 2017, 2019, Windows 10, Windows 11, that support is going to be continued into the foreseeable future. With the .NET framework, so starting 1.8, the release we're talking about today, any computers or servers, so the client or the server, that's going to be running the Prism application needs to be at the .NET Framework 4.8. Now, if you've been doing your regular Windows updates, that shouldn't be a problem. The Windows 10 update in May 2019 included this, but if you're not sure, you can reach out to your IT department and they'll tell you what you're up to. Another big part of all of these releases that we're going to be talking about is ECMPS 2.0. Now, Prism 1.8, the one we just released, is going to include beta support for ECMPS 2.0. Now, the reason we're calling it beta support is because the ECMPS 2.0 system is also in beta, which means that even right now, if our product and ECMPS 2.0 are completely in sync, meaning that you can submit everything, no problems, there's no bugs, anything like that, ECMPS 2.0 is still undergoing development on their end. And so as they make changes and improvements, we may fall out of sync with their requirements. So that being said, if you set up yourself on Prism 1.8, I still strongly encourage you to generate the JSON files and all that for ECMPS 2.0 and submit them to the ECMPS 2.0 beta site and start playing around with it, see if you run into any issues. And then if you do find issues, report back to us so that we can fix those issues before 1.9. So in Prism 1.9, it's going to be a full feature support for ECMPS 2.0, meaning that by 1.9, we plan to fully support ECMPS 2.0. You should be able to report to that system from Prism 1.9. Now, currently, 1.9 is planned for around February of 2024. Right. So in summary, ECMPS 2.0 might be the required submittal form by January of 2024. That's up to the EPA. Currently, it looks like we're on track for that, but that's out of our control. Prism 1.9, if you are required to submit to ECMPS 2.0, Prism 1.9 will be required for you because the version we're releasing today probably will not meet all of the needs that ECMPS 2.0 will have. So if you're a customer that cares about ECMPS submittals, you're going to have to get up to 1.9, the next release. Now, to be on 1.9 and 1.8, the release we're talking about today, your system is going to have to be on .NET 4.8. And then finally, Prism 1.9, the next one, will require the minimum version of SQL Server to be 2016. Now, and this is normally when we say we'll require this, normally when we say we don't support a thing anymore, it's because we just stopped testing against it. But maybe it would still work. We just don't test against it. But this time I'm saying that there are actually features that will break if you're not on at least 2016. So don't upgrade to 1.9 if you do not meet the minimum requirement of SQL Server 2016. All right, features. ECMPS 2.0, like I just mentioned, so for those of you who aren't familiar, Part 75 systems, stuff like that, you report your data to ECMPS, EPA, all that, and they've undergone an effort. They've redone that system to switch from XML file types to JSON file types. And there's a lot of reasons they chose to do that. And so we're working to support that. And as I mentioned, this is going to be a beta feature right now. I strongly recommend anybody who downloads 1.8 start using this, start playing around with it. Give us your feedback, because that allows us to fix any potential issues that you may have before it comes time, before it goes live, before it really matters. Right. So with ECMPS 2.0 JSON support, like I said, they extended their reporting to use JSON type files. This is going to affect both the import and the export of monitoring plans, QA, QC files, and emissions files. In support of this, we had to make updates to the qualifier service, database updater service, ECMPS module, all so that they'll be able to work with these different file types and the data that comes with them. There was really no user interface changes required to support this feature, other than just some really minor label things. And we will continue to support the XML format as long as is needed. As long as customers need XML files for whatever reason, we're going to continue to support it. So we're not going to drop the old way anytime soon. All right. So just to kind of show you what these things look like if you're not familiar, with the ECMPS 2.0 monitoring plans, you can go to admin, part 75, if you have that kind of system monitoring plans. And this is just like before with the XML, except now you have the option to pick your file type, and you can select JSON documents in addition to XML. So if you select the JSON, it'll import a JSON file. Right. With the ECMP, with the QA QC files, this updates the formats that we support for these kind of things. So with import, you can import RADA data, appendix E correlation, fuel flow to load stuff, and then we support the exporting of fuel flow to load check data, fuel linearities, and so on. Now, with the QA/QC files, if you're looking to import this stuff, you would go to admin part 75 QA cert data, and then when you went to import them, you can see you have the option to import either the XML or the JSON versions now. Now, if you wanted to export to create these files from Prism, you would launch the ECMPS reporting module, and in this case, the linearity subtab, and you could select your item and hit generate report, and you can select the file type that you want to generate it as. And along the same lines, under the Part 75 tab of the reporting module, you can also generate, whatever kind you want. And finally, the emissions. From the reporting module, you can export the emissions file in these formats. All right. Another big feature we added, which is I think pretty cool, I think this will be a helpful one for people in the long run, is we added a charting module to Prism. So before, we did have the trends in Prism, and we still have trends. We're not going to drop that just yet, but it was kind of limited. It wasn't a very good user interface. It wasn't as pretty of a picture. It didn't produce PDFs. It was just much more limited. And so we wanted to bring in better charting, better data visualization. And this is kind of in line with a feature that exists on the Stack Vision side of things. So we're trying to share what's good between the products, and this is an example of that. So what's the purpose of this? Well, it provides ability to chart both scatter plots and line graphs of various data points. It alleviates the need to export the data to Excel for simple use cases. Obviously, if you need to do advanced analysis, Excel is the place to go. But if you want to just be able to create some good graphs right off the bat, this is helpful. It can plot both semi-qualified and qualified data. So that's your tag data and your qual data. And it can also filter on things such as the offline, invalid, and substituted data statuses of your data. Right. So first, the scatter chart. For a scatter chart, also known, if you're familiar with the term, it's a correlation chart. It plots one data point versus another. So in other words, you specify the data for your y-axis and you specify the data for your x-axis. And this allows you to find relationships between things like maybe heat and CO2 emissions, or just anything that you want to find a relationship between. And this module will also, if you want it to, provide you with the best fit line, standard deviation, and R-squared data. So it can give you a trend line to help you find these correlations between these things. Also, the points in this chart are color coded by valid, substituted, and invalid. And if you look on the left side there, you can actually check and uncheck the offline, invalid, and substituted. So you can, in effect, filter the data that you're seeing in your graph here. Right? So that's the scatter chart where we're doing some data value against some data value. On the line chart, you can pick multiple data values of interest and you can have them all be plotted on top of each other. And then the x-axis is time, the date. So this just shows you trends over time. You can turn each of these series of data on and off individually. You can add these reference lines. So you can see in that one there, this had a reference for high load, a reference for high SO2. And on these charting modules, you have the ability to print these things off, to create PDFs, create PNGs, which are image files. So hopefully this will help you guys be able to visualize the data better, have just a quick way to view things that are going on. Maybe here on the correlation, you can see outliers that, oh, that's invalid. So, that's why it's way off the curve, things like that. So give you a better view into your data. All right. LME NOx rate defaults derived from Appendix E testing. So we had customers ask for the ability to use NOx rate defaults derived from Appendix E testing for all this. So these LME unit defaults would be provided per the monitoring system and used in the calculations if the ECMPS hour falls within the effective date to expired date. If the hour falls outside of that, it will refer to the monitoring plan defaults. So currently, this is only a backend feature. In the future, we'll have a user interface. So what that means is right now, to use this feature, there is a new table in the database that you'll have to go in manually, but we will have a user interface in the future. So how it works is we have this new table, this ECMPS long-term fuel flow parameters table, and this lets us set up these relationships between the qualified parameters of interest, and in this case, the parameter code 7, which is NOx rate, and you can assign an in-control value and a non-control value. And then when the ECMPS engine runs, it can go ahead and do these substitutions based on the in-control status and out-of-control status. So I don't want to dwell on this too much, but if you have some follow-up questions about this, especially if this pertains to your site specifically, go ahead and reach out to us and we can give like some more detailed information about this feature. All right, unmonitored bypass configuration support. So purpose of this, customers had units which were no longer reported in ECMPS as multi-stack configurations. However, during online bypass emergency event, bypassed emissions must still be reported in ECMPS. So before, an online emergency bypass emissions were not calculated as required. So now Prism supports unmonitored bypass stacks by using the ByMax approach for reporting bypass emissions in ECMPS. Prism does not, however, currently support the use of certified inlet monitors as substituted data. Prism RADA import. We added the ability to report separately. So when importing a flow RADA, Prism gives the option to create a flow to load reference. And some sites with flow have multiple stacks and currently use the report separately function when generating flow to load references. And so customers wanted the ability to report separately when importing the flow RADA through Prism and selecting the generate flow to load reference. So the way you would use this feature is here on the QA cert. You can check that little box for report separately. Reports. So we actually made quite a few changes with the reports. When I say changes, I mean additions. So the first one was that the server installer was improved so that it uploads new reports automatically. And the point of this is just make sure that everybody's up to date on the most recent reports as things get added. Before, this was actually a manual task. Sometimes people would have to support, or whoever would have to go and manually add some of these reports in. Now the server installer manages that. And so going this a little bit further, we actually added 4 new reports in this release based on customer feedback and feedback from support. So the first one is the peaking unit qualification report. So the purpose of this was to have a report that generates the necessary data for Part 75 peaking units. So the peaking unit qualification report pulls the ECMPS data for the date range that you ask, and it allows it to easily generate ECMPS records for peaking qualifications. So customers who have units with have peaking unit designations in their monitoring plans would benefit from this report because they'd no longer have to manually retrieve and review the data for the qualification report when updating the monitoring plan with these records. Prism determines the hours as well as the peaking percentages in the report. So this is what it looks like. You get to this through the reports module like anything else. When you launch this, you have to provide it the start date, end date, the reporting group of interest, and the max hourly HTIP. Our next additional report is the gas-fired qualification report. So for this one is here to generate the data necessary for Part 75 Appendix D units. Now this report pulls the operating records and compares the number of gas-only hours to other fuels and compiles the information needed for submitting the gas-fired qualification record in the monitoring plan in ECMPS. So this is helpful for customers who use gas-fired qualification records where they run more than one fuel. And this would benefit them because they no longer need to manually determine what percentage of the time gas was used as opposed to other fuels. So if you went to run the report, this is what you'd see. It asks you for the start date, end date of interest, and then the unit of interest. And you can see it's showing you how much the percentage gas fired. And then it's set up by year here. Right. Next one, we have the Part 75 Cumulative Emissions Report. So this one provides the ability to see a summary of Part 75 emissions data for a given year. It avoids the need to navigate the more detailed reports for shorter time spans. And this was actually a replication of a report on the StackVision side, which was used regularly by the reporting group. The reporting group being the people that, check the data and help assist with the ECMPS reporting. So anyone who is a Part 75 customer that submits measured values would benefit from this report. So this is what it looks like. Yeah, and one of the valuable things about this report is that it will actually warn the user when the Part 75 missing data needs to be run by the ECMPS module. So you can see there's some data missing there in January, so it indicates to the user that that should be done. All right, and finally, the parameter deviation report. So basically, this report is an improved version of the leak check report that works for any Part 75 reported parameter instead of just CO2 and heat input. Now, in the future, this is actually meant to replace the leak check. We're not going to drop the leak check just yet. Make sure that everybody's happy with this report first. But this report prevents the need to set up multiple baselines. It provides the ability to compare data from 2 different time periods. And sort of the genesis of this is that we had a customer that had been audited for CO2 values not being within range, and they found a CO2 leak. And so as a result, they wanted to be able to verify all of their parameters, not just CO2 and heat input. So this report should be helpful for anyone with a Part 75 system. So this is what it looks like. Highlights of it should be easier to use than leak checks. This report can be run on any of these following parameter types. Okay. All right, that's all the reports. So source administration, 8864 cold start button is no longer in preview. Those of you who were in the 1.7 webinar, you might have remembered that we added this new feature under preview features, which, if you're not aware, is a little option that you can toggle on and off in the settings bar to show preview features, or i.e. like beta features that we want to get out there for the customers to play with, but they're not ready for prime time. So we kind of, in other words, it's just a beta feature that you can turn on and off. But we put the feature out there, it worked pretty well. Customers, it seemed like it was a popular feature. So we went ahead and moved it from being a preview feature to a full-fledged feature. The feature itself didn't change at all. You no longer have to turn on preview features to see it. And if you're not familiar, what this feature does is if you have an 8864 source setup, and you have all the channels and calibration sequences and Modbus and all that configured with Prism for the 8864, you can just hit the cold start button, confirm that you want a cold start bit, and it will send the cold start command to the logger, i.e. it's basically a factory reset. And then once it comes back online, it will download all the channels, all the digitals, all the calibration sequences, and the Modbus server.cfg thing. So essentially, it's meant to be an easy button to set up your 8864. Like, let's say you had to swap one out, for example. Like something blew up. You could plug it in, just hit the button, and it should program your 8864 for you and get you back up to speed. Keep in mind though, a cold start, it does clear the data out of the logger. So don't run the cold start unless you're okay with the data that has been collected by the logger being deleted, because it's basically a factory reset. All right, tag configuration. We added the ability to set the online tag for digital tags. So the online tag can now be set for digital tags using the user interface. Yeah, before, if you wanted to be able to do this, you had to do it through the database, but now we have a user interface. Object association editor, we added more detailed information. So the request was made to provide more details on the objects when you're adding and updating them. So before it was just a name, but now we're using the name and the description, and there's also a hover where you can see a little bit more detailed information. And this was helpful because, you can see on the left before, here's all your source objects, and you can imagine, look, there's 4 different flows there. How are you supposed to know which one that you're trying to associate? And so what we've done is on the right side, you can see of the source object, it says what kind of source object you're dealing with. And then when you're picking them, it gives you the name and the description. And then down at the bottom, you can see the associated object. It's, oh, you're looking at the tag listing, and you can see all the things listed out from there. So hopefully this makes it a little easier to use this feature, a little bit less guess and check. All right, security roles and permissions. We added the permission to edit a raw point as its own permission. So by default, the modify raw points permission is only assigned to admin, but you can go in and add this role or add this permission to other roles now. And this was an important permission to add because editing raw points, it also affects some of the tables in the background. So. All right, application administration added a setting to delay warnings about stale data. So this provides the ability to adjust the delay that takes place before Prism begins writing warnings about stale data to the SEMS log. And this is because in some configurations and network setups, long delays between updates can occur. And this allows administrators to adjust these warning intervals appropriate to their network. In other words, let's say you're pulling data and there's a dropout for a little while. Sometimes that can end up being a nuisance alarm on a certain system, and so now we have this this option to adjust it. So if you wanted to make this change, you can go to Admin, SEMS and Site, Application Configuration, and then you can adjust this additional time. So by default, it's at 0. So this feature, if you upgrade, this isn't going to change the behavior of your system at all unless you come in and change the setting. And this is how long after the default time. So the default time is 15 minutes, and the setting is in addition to that. Application administrations added the no cache option to the tag service. So if you navigated to application administration, you now see this yes and no check for no cache. The no cache option, it provides the ability to disable caching of tag values. It's disabled by default. meaning that by default, it does cache the data. Now, enabling this option triggers polling of any devices used to compute the tag value each time it's updated. And this is intended for all-in-one systems with no data backup and calculations. So the pros of this, like why might you want to use this? Well, it's faster updates and response times when controlling devices. But the cons of it, it may cause heavy network traffic and may cause performance issues. In other words, when you're using the caching, you have that data closer to you, and it doesn't have to go out over the network to get the things. But if you're trying to, but that being said, if you want to have direct real-time communication, controlling the stuff faster, then maybe you would turn this off if you weren't worried about the additional network traffic that it would have to be reaching out to do. Raw point administration group add. So this provides the ability to add a contiguous range of raw points to a source at once. Because before, adding hundreds of raw points one by one through the existing user interface really wasn't very practical. And so adding this feature, it really cuts down the time needed to add raw points to a source. And so if you were adding a new source or if you're setting up a new system, this can really help speed things up for you. So for example, here with a Modbus source, you would add this new thing and you would specify the starting point, the starting address, the register type, point type. And when you hit create, it would, from the starting address, add all of the points that you specified with the number of points. For 8864 sources, very similar, you specify the number of points. If it's for digitals, it has to be in increments of 16 because the digital points are blocked like that. And you just give it the starting address, you hit create, and it runs down the sequence of creation. Object associations, add the tag ID. Should talk about this earlier. We talked about the object association dropdown recently in the previous slides where it included the name, description, and all that, but we wanted to make it a little bit more helpful still. And so you can see that when you hover the mouse over the tag there, the little tooltip that will pop up is the tag ID. And the tag, as some of you may know, the tag ID is very important because that's actually how these objects are linked in the background. By the way, in contrast, on the Stack Vision side, they use the name of it instead. And so, but for this case, that value, if you just hover over, it's the actual tag ID. All right, data collector service. We changed the default behavior when the Modbus slave is not communicating. So this update improves Modbus's handling of communication failures. Before, if the registers were not written to by the Modbus master in over 20 or 30 seconds, the slave would stop communicating and essentially appear to be frozen until the communication resumed. The old behavior was technically fine since there was no data anyway, but we got requests from support and customers asking us to change this. And so now when the data has not been received, beyond that threshold, 20, 30 seconds, now it's going to mark the data as invalid, bad sample, and then publish the device alarm, the no communication alarm. And then it's going to continue to update with the last values, but make sure that, but it'll set the no data sample, and then it'll continue to mark it as that until the communication is resumed. So this will ensure that the service keeps running and nothing gets hung up while it's waiting on communications to resume. And Modbus isn't really capable of backpulling anyway, so yeah, so this makes sense. All right, CGA module. They're the new Appendix F performance specifications for Part 60 parameters. As some of you may know, there was a recent change with regard to Appendix F, Part 60 QA, that went into effect May 2023. And so the old specification was that for CGAs, you had a plus or minus 15% of the average audit value or plus or minus 5 ppm, whichever is greater. And this is for, and then for diluent monitors, it's plus minus 15% of the average audit value. But this specification has been changed as of May 30th, where based on the span, you have an alternate CGA criteria that applies. And so here, plus or minus 5 ppm, 3 ppm, 2 ppm, depending on the analyzer's span. And so we implemented this in 1.8. So there's not a whole lot, by the way, there's not a whole lot of sites that will be affected by this because it requires Part 60 NOx SO2 instruments. And so since there's no ways to reevaluate the previous CGA results, this only applies to CGAs created after the update that will use this new specification. All right, bug fixes. So we actually made like lots of like literal minor bugs that we had fixed just to kind of improve user experience and visibility, things like that. They're not part of this presentation. I'm only focusing on the kind of the major things that were either reported to us by the customers or that I felt like kind of affected your workflow the most. But just know there was we did a lot more work in fixing a bunch of other little stuff too. We're just not talking about them today. So one of the first issues was that there was a problem where the non-installed modules would still be listed as available. So in a previous release, there was a bug related to the GUIDs, which is how Windows kind of tracks what application we have on hand, and there's some duplicates that existed. And so in certain situations, you could install the Prism client, and it would look like you had modules on hand that you didn't actually install. And so we fixed that. Now the installer doesn't create these duplicates, and so the modules that you see are the modules that you get. Along those same lines, there was an issue where the client modules, even if you wouldn't have them, with the if you would uninstall them, the modules would get uninstalled, but they would persist in the start menu, so it looked like you have them even though you uninstalled them, and created some confusion. So now when you uninstall it, for sure it pulls them out of the start menu as well. All right. Dashboard ID not displayed correctly in startup session admin. If you're not familiar, we have the startup session editor where you can create those SView files that launch, the Prism application or the ECMPS module, like, all those different things. And so there was a minor little issue where you had this option for the dashboard ID and it wasn't being mapped over properly. It would just always display 0, but now that's been updated. So there was a bug regarding the raw point scaling. In other words, what would happen is, as a user, if I went to, edit the raw point scaling through this IO widget page, I could change the scaling, and the scaling would, get applied to the database. It would do everything it was supposed to do, except the data collector service wouldn't register that update until it was restarted. Not something that people need to do very often, but it could cause confusion, and so we fixed it. Now when that change is pushed, or when that change is made by the user, it pushes it to the data collector service, and you don't have to restart the data collector service for these changes to get propagated. All right, expired tags show up in the Prism raw points. So this is kind of a weird edge situation, but there was a little deal where if a tag targeted a raw point, if that tag was deleted and then another tag targeting the same point was created, the name of the old tag would still be shown in the IO page. Kind of a minor thing, you guys probably haven't come across this too often, but now we fixed that. It'll update, the page as you expect. Sequence step pop-up editor hidden. There was an issue where if you did a certain, order of button clicks on the calibration sequences editor page, you could end up in this situation where your confirmation dialog was being blocked by this pop-up, which, it's not great. So we fixed that. Now, when the confirmation dialog comes to the front, you can hit OK, cancel as expected. All right. There was a issue where the sequence step delete button wasn't selectable. And so, we fix that. Now, when you go into sequences, select your sequence, select your step, you can hit the delete button as expected, and you get your confirmation. You get your message up top saying it worked, and then, yeah. All right. SEMS log timeout. This is kind of a weird little issue we found. It was reported that if you have a system that just has a huge amount of entries in the SEM log, when you go to launch the main application, it could actually kind of bog down because there's too many entries in that table, and it would make the log look blank rather than showing you, just the most recent ones. And so this has been fixed. It's been optimized. It only looks at the most recent things. It won't get bogged down if you have 10,000 entries in your logs table. There was an issue where the 8864 overrides would persist when they shouldn't have. Sorry. Yep. And so now when you go to do these overrides, they kind of disappear as expected.